Alright, so today we're going to talk about the lore of Lords Mobile, and more specifically, we're going to talk about the story with Shapeshifter and Eloise, which is Lightweaver, and then oh, or is it? Oh, no, actually, never mind. But we'll get into it. So basically, right, the story of Lilith in particular, or Shapeshifter, is that she's basically got a crystal on her back, and she's actually nuts. Like, out of all the heroes in the game, the weird thing about it is not every hero is really a quote unquote hero, guys. Thing is she's actually horrible. She had taunted him and saved him from the very end, and she considered herself bored by taunting him over and over, and he was terrified with knock knock jokes. And that's Shapeshifter. Shapeshifter is pretty crazy evil, okay? Now, it should be worth mentioning that she just kind of drowns. So, kind of weird to say the least. But there's a running theme with every single hero in Lords Mobile, which is that they all generally get, well, how do you say, off by a guy named Nox. You'll notice in the story of Grimwolf with Fenrir that Nox is basically transforming these people into lichens, which, as most people know, lycanthropy is nothing more than basically being turned into a werewolf. And Fenrir's story is basically him as being a soldier turned into a werewolf. Believe it or not, Twilight Priestess happens to be a goddess of darkness who just so happens to be at the hands of Nox's followers. So in some ways, more than one, you find that the term Nox gets thrown around a lot. In fact, you'll even know that Necrolord happens to be, revived from Nox. Conveniently, you find Nox is mentioned in a lot of different places. So, in a way, while we don't really see the guy, Nox is the bad, evil guy in the whole damn story of Lords Mobile. He's basically the bad evildoer that runs the whole show. He's the main villain. Whether you actually knew that or not, now you know. Now, in terms of realms and where they all are, you have the Dragon Kingdom, which is basically, you got Dream Witch, and then you've got yourself, believe it or not, Chaos Dragon. They're related. Who would have guessed, right? And then you've got the, Human Kingdom. You've got like this Woodlands Kingdom, which is, basically like Prima Donna and Death Archer, Child of Light. That's kind of in their area. There's like a northern region where Barbarian and Berserker reside. Um, somewhere in between the Woodlands and the Human Kingdom is where Trickster resides. So he's kind of in the bars and banks of all of that in between. The same thing kind of goes on with Bombing Goblin, but that's between the Dwarven Kingdom. And Dwarven Kingdom is like Soul Forger and Tracker and Bombing Goblin and that group of folk. And of course, you'll hear mention of Night Raven, and Night Raven and Songstress know each other because they're on the ocean seaside of things. And so, obviously, in the ocean seaside of things, that's where you got the Murlocs like Sea Squire, and you basically have the swamps, and then you have the ocean, and then obviously underneath the ocean, which you got like Necrolord and Songstress of the Sea, obviously being underwater. Then you got like Snow Princess, Cursed Hunter being on the water, Boommeister happened to be on the water, working for the Human Kingdom. You see a lot of. It's weird because even like Rose Knight, for example, happens to be the daughter of Oathkeeper. You know of Don Guapo and Prince of Thieves being tied together in part because they happen to know each other. But they're in the desert, which, hey, yeah, who'd have guessed, right? Just when you thought, oh, I have the woodlands and this, and you also have the desert and the desert kingdoms. And so, conveniently, it's like you've got all these different locations, volcanoes and deserts, and then you obviously have a whole, and obviously, is there something missing in this whole story? Yeah, you don't have desert tiles really in this game. Kind of a funny thing, it's like you hear mention of it, right? But have you ever noticed that, there's an ice tundra, there's a grass land, and then there's, volcanic areas once in a while, right? But you don't ever see any mention of the desert anywhere. You got the mountains and the highlands, right? But you don't actually have desert tiles, which then kind of makes me wonder if IGG had ever really thought of doing that, It's like it was maybe an idea that they had running through their ideas and never got around to. I don't really know if that was ever really thought about long enough for them to go, yeah, well, we probably ought to do that. Like, I have no idea, but I'm just telling you guys up front, like, from the lore's perspective, and evidently there should be. Will we ever actually see it on the map? I don't know. But the connection between like the lore and the world map is also inherently tied because you might notice that hey, we're in a dragon kingdom. Hey, there's a there's a dwarven kingdom. Hey, you've got a human kingdom, and then you've even got like some variations of arcanists, and you even have even these almost molten factories that look like more like your Steambot kingdom and stuff like that. Which, believe it or not, I don't even think this is Steambot so much as it's actually this has always been a question mark for me because you look at like some of these kingdoms, right? Not all of the kingdoms are made equal, but even certain kingdoms like this one, where it's like, oh, okay, so it's kind of like a molten factory, and it's like every kingdom has its own little kingdom, but there's obviously a lot of duplicates in here. Now, obviously, if you went to go say to the royal battleground, the royal battleground's just a giant temple statue of a leader on top of what are a pair of lions and some kind of arcanic. The main thing is that it's centered around frozen tundra, right? Now, you might also notice that if you look at Dragon Arena, it's basically a volcanic doomscape with what appears to be desert. Okay, so weirdly enough, right, when you look in the lore of these heroes, weirdly enough, that also ties into the actual worlds that you see. Now, the thing is, though, right, is even within the worlds, there are realms. Okay, so I've only mentioned a couple of the realms so far, but you know of the territories and the land of Lords Mobile, but there's actually even realms in Lords Mobile. So Magmaroid and Elementalist come from the realm. Believe it or not, Big Eye comes from the land of giants, but the thing about him in particular that's kind of interesting is that the whole story and the background to Big Guy in particular is kind of interesting in part because he became a human being, but there was a land of giants. And while you don't ever see or hear or know about them, there's an entire realm of giants that apparently exist that are just kind of staring at you, kind of like a Jack and the Beanstalk story, sort of. So it does kind of beg the question of when or if we'll ever see anything from the giant realm, any more so than we will see from what realm that Petite Devil makes mention of, which also seems to be tied to Shapeshifter a little bit, because there's this realm that is weirdly enough, at least for them, they get banished to that causes them to go completely mad. And I don't know if this is like in any way tied to the Arcanists a little bit. And going back to the topic of Arcanists, who are they? Okay, so Snow Queen is one of the Arcanists because she ends up joining and causing a war between the humans and effectively what ends up being everything around them. Incinerator, which I think, as you might imagine, she's just kind of, like defining Arcanists is kind of more a question of who do you presume to be in control of effectively what is a giant temple full of what only can be described as magic. And obviously there are some mention of like some heroes like Sage's Storm, for example, who we know is immortal, but the thing about it is you know immortality comes at a cost, and his job, as far as in the story of Lords Mobile, was to basically prevent the creatures that come through the realm. And so, in some ways, more than one, while you don't ever actually see mention of more of these, I have a feeling that going forward, if we ever do see anything, we'll see more of these creatures from the realm. Because, kind of like Petite Devil and both Petite Devil and Shapeshifter, it's like they come from some type of otherworldly madness that creates people to basically have a form of mania, psychosis, and some form of where basically they turn into laughing, almost Joker like um, craziness in a way. Like they're almost part of like an entirely different world, and it's not very clear if that's just the magic that is imbued in them, or if they're actually in an like banished realm, so to speak. there's not a whole lot of, how do you say, clarity on this to say heads or tails of what exactly it is that they're talking about. But outside of the big picture, right, with Lords Mobile in particular, when you look at the game from the scope of not only its kingdoms and its individual lore regarding the heroes and stuff like that, you might also have noticed that, even castle skins in some fashion actually kind of tie in a little bit. So, individual castle skins outside of the collaboration skins, each skin is basically telling a story of different areas that exist. Like, for example, the Lion Keep, you can only assume that's in reference to the main battleground. It's actually logical in the way that they're tied together because Lion Keep actually gives you Wonder Rally bonuses. Now, like one of the newer skins that we got to see was the Eternal Flame. Now, the Eternal Flame, again, one of the temples that has a spinning, almost as you could describe as an Arcanist type symbol. So it's kind of implied that this is probably where Incinerator or the likes of Incinerator come from. And it's like, okay, here you have Phoenix, Incinerator, you've got Oceans, and then obviously you have like Void Unicorn kind of stands out because it's part of a triangular, almost like different realm that it's weird to think about within the context of this way, but like here you got a wizard from the mysterious manor, and you obviously have the SS Wyvern, which is you even have people in the skies, and you don't have a whole lot of mention of this with Boonmeister in particular. You don't really know if is there something ruling in the skies. Obviously, we have mention of the Woodland Warren, the Macabre Mansion. Uh, some of these are obviously like in their own right, kind of just castle skins, right? But I bring this up because they kind of establish what to expect in all these different regions. And so, in one way or another, even like the Steam Shack being kind of like a factory, you've got a lot of different things at play here as far as when it comes to the individual heroes and the stories and lore regarding all of them. Now, I mean, I would say one of the few heroes that you would think, oh yeah, that's a good hero. No. Like, this hero is actually evil in part because she gives you basically her own little jewels of helplessness that she feeds off of the wealth and beauty. Basically, she feeds off of other people's desires. She supposedly tries to cure them, and she doesn't. She's actually like an extortionist, basically. Weirdly enough, not all heroes are actual heroes in Lords of Mobile. It's weird how that works, but that is basically the more you learn about the heroes, the more you start to see that the morality and the ethics of certain heroes is actually not there. Like they're really not who we would think of as a hero, And so getting into the meat and potatoes of what is basically a mobile game's explanation to lore is that while all of these heroes are all connected, they also kind of explain who the factions are in relation to who is on whose side here. So, like, for example, the dwarves and the humans hate each other. The humans hated the dragons so much that they blew them to smithereens. They destroyed the dragon kingdoms, and then conveniently, Eloise and Chaos Dragon and Draxitos basically had their entire dragon kingdom brought back, only to then, for them to basically revenge off of what happened. The Arcanists obviously don't really care because they're in some ways more than one. They're the ones who caused the whole war with the humans, and basically they're the ones to blame for it in a way. And while you don't see a whole lot of mention of the Dwarven kingdoms, again, going back to this particular castle skin, or kingdom skin, I guess, is where do these people lie and who are they? Because you can't really tell by looking at it if that's Dwarven or if it's, is it in relation to the other realm? We don't really know. And so in some ways, I almost wonder if we'll have more heroes to kind of fill this void because this castle skin doesn't really explain it so much. The same can also be said for the Arcanists. Like, I have a feeling we may end up seeing a lot more from these two particular brackets because there's not enough information there, and therefore it almost seems as if that we might one day see it. The other thing, too, is, we have so much mention of, basically ocean type um, heroes, and yet we don't have any ocean kingdom. And so it does kind of beg the question if they'll ever explore that on the world map, is whether or not will we actually have ocean kingdoms. Because even now, while yes, I understand a lot of people will look at me sideways and go, "Really? Are you really going this far into the weeds?" It's like, well, you kind of have to. When the game's literally got over 1,000 kingdoms, you then start to question at what point are they finally going to just, start doing something interesting with the world map? Because the world map is nothing more than a giant map full of kingdoms, and whether or not, they're restricted, whether or not they've got, the names of the kingdoms are also kind of random in a way. Like you almost start to question is there actually a logic to some of the names that they've picked for some of these kingdoms? Because every kingdom has a name, believe it or not, and no, it is not dictated by the guild that was in it either. So there is a stupid number of them, though, and there's like an almost unconscionable amount of kingdoms written by their name, and yet you don't ever actually see that many people refer to their kingdom by their actual name as opposed to their number. Weird that, after a certain point, people will start to look at it more from their name and not so much their name itself. But the kingdom name actually is relevant these days. When you look at it from the bigger picture of how not only the lore is impacting the way the heroes are coming in, but even just like in general, like with familiars, and even like when you look into Vergeway, for example, there's a number of portraits and hero monsters and stuff like that that we don't even see in any other place in the game other than in Vergeway. And so it does kind of add to the question of like if they'll ever explore that. Because it's all opportunities that, while we don't see it, it could be one of those things. We may end up seeing one of these days. But naturally, with all the lore, I would say that out of all the stories that are out there that I feel as though are really interesting, I would say that a person really should dive into Shapeshifters lore a little bit. And of course, if you haven't already, you really ought to also connect the dots with what we find in, and I'll actually show you here. So we got to go into tier rewards here and then click on this, and then click on this, and you can get to Shapeshifter this way in case you didn't already know. But you can basically go in here and you'll see that Shapeshifter's story in here. The other fun thing that's noteworthy with Shapeshifter in particular, like even the new leader portraits and stuff, is that, it's weird, but it's like the alternative leader skins that they've created also kind of introduce like a whole different lore to the individual heroes too. Because like Ashen Queen, for example, is kind of like what does that say about Dream Witch in particular? Because Dream Witch right now looks like a relatively happy, and then once again those two bottles, almost like mixtured with Elementalist too in a way, right? But she comes off seemingly easy, simple, and just not like evil, right? But when you look at Ashen Queen, it's like a whole polar spin on that. It's like as if Dream Witch had paired up with Chaos Dragon, and then she's gone into revenge mode, and Ashen Queen is the answer to that. And the thing is that the new skin for like Oathkeeper is much the same thing. Here you have an Oathkeeper who looks innocent and knows what he's up against, to a Dragon Slayer who is somebody that very obviously looks like he's very intentionally going after and has had seen combat and is older. And we can only make that assessment because of the fact that he's got he has actual. I mean, when you look at the actual skin for this, and again, this some people are going to look at me sideways and go, "You're thinking way too much on this," but he's aged. Like he's actually got a mustache, and he's got he's actually almost in some ways more than one. You could almost argue that he's developed into something more, and the weird thing is it's like based on his armor, it's turned dark. It almost comes off evil in a way. And so I almost wonder if the direction that they're trying to get across here is that there's basically a pivotal moment at which basically Dream Witch and Oathkeeper go into a darker period in their lives. And so it does make you wonder if the next leader skins we see are going to be like a dark, evil version of Rose Knight, or a dark evil version of even like, well, even now Chaos Dragon is kind of dark and evil, but I don't know what spin they might even play on that. Even now he already kind of looks pretty goddamn evil as it is, but I don't know. They might add a different spin to this. And the thing is even like certain heroes in the game, like I've only mentioned a handful of them, but yet the storyline between, like, say, somebody like Death Knight, for example, is kind of interesting in part because, okay, it's basically a human being that went out in search of eternal life, much in the same way like anyone else, but he went into the cave and then turned undead and became a monster, right? And you see this theme over and over and over again within the story, which is that basically people had gone out and venture forth, and it changed them, and it permanently did damage to them in ways that they could no longer go back from. And even Blink, which is Shade, it's weird that the story of somebody even like this, he's an assassin, so it then begs the question of, like, obviously he's got a lot of pointy swords and stuff like that, but whose side is he on? Is he working for the humans, or is there a bigger story at play here? Could we find that more, you know if anything, maybe there's more connections there in that whole area, because we don't know a whole lot about the assassins, really. They're almost kind of a blank splits, almost a blank slate in a way. Because you look at like something that happens with, say Boommeister, for example, and we know he was a humanoid, basically without fighting as a pirate, is basically what he ended up being. But he was working for the humans at one point or another. And so it's funny that like even like Steambot, for example, Steambot is basically it's basically Skynet. He basically turned into a droid that came alive because the dwarves made a robot that basically came alive. The weird thing about that though is that if you look at like Witch Doll, it's not a very different story. Witch Doll basically was in the in the circus, and it's just a clockwork doll. But then she ends up running into Anderson, which, as we know, is Sage of Storms, and then with a little bit of magic, she becomes basically an immortal droid. And so it's like, okay, you start to see a kind of a familiar pattern here, which is that with imbued magic, you can bring even the inanimate being animate and being alive in some fashion. But then it's weird because it's like you look at what's going on in the story, and I mean even like Darkfaller, for example, is interesting because he lives in Sanctuary, which, as we know now, we've already got Sanctuary, so that's no longer like something that it was mentioned in the lore. So we had Darkfaller before Sanctuary was even a thing. But now that Sanctuary is a thing in the game, and we know that is the way in which we build and repair our troops, the interesting story regarding Jonas for Darkfaller is that his entity was possessed and destroyed by the Sanctuary. He was a slave to the darkness, and he continued to fight this hopeless battle, be free from the curse. It's weird when you listen to this. The world shall burn in eternal darkness. Like, what's weird about it is it makes Sanctuary sound as though it's a curse. That when you die in going into Sanctuary, which is effectively, as we know it, it's basically how you get your troops back. You get 1.2 million in the capacity, obviously, but the story of this Sanctuary is kind of interesting, in part because it takes in the wandering souls, those who have fallen in battle but cannot enter the infirmary. The goddess blesses those with devotion with the power to resurrect these poor souls. The weird thing is it's like as if within the context of the lore of Lords Mobile, it's that Darknests and the armies of Darknests are nothing more than the downed souls or the dead. And Nox is probably the one responsible for have created these. And all the Oracle does is purify them so they are no longer servants of Nox, and instead are servants of you. But yet it's kind of messy. It's kind of screwy, really, because when you think about it, it's like people kill millions of troops, and if you put that to human lives, it's like, okay, that would actually be kind of that's a mind screw when you put people's lives and like individual people to numbers. That's like when it just suddenly like goes a little wacky in your head, you know? It's like you don't really feel that way, you don't even really think that way until you know, somebody like me mentions it to you. But, you know, even in the context of somebody like this, who, mind you, okay, it's bizarre to think that even necrosis is kind of like a result in a way. It's like he's a monster, right? But how do you get those monsters? And in some ways, that monster looks scary similar to human beings. And you just can't help but wonder if there's a bigger story behind that. But naturally, it's a mobile game. I'm probably going a little too far on a tangent on something that maybe some of you might care about. But I, for one, can tell you that with my little theorizing in this quick deep dive into the lore of Lords Mobile, here's what my predictions are. Which is to say that I think we'll probably see more madness type heroes, meaning you'll see more heroes that are madness Joker like. Like, if we ever seen one, I think we'll see more petite devil like heroes that are part of this Joker esque realm. You know, I think we'll probably see more into the giant realm because you don't really see or hear anything mentioned about it. And I think you'll also more than likely see more of the realm in general, because the realm is something that isn't explored as much in Lords. You know, you already kind of have a pretty good foundation of where all the people are in relation to the huge map, but you don't really see the conversation outside of our realm. You know, so obviously I think the Dwarven Kingdom has got some. I think we could probably see more from the Dragon Kingdom potentially. Even the same could be said for the human kingdom realm too. I think you could see more in that regard as well. But ultimately, that is pretty much the lore. Um, I will say that if we ever end up seeing anything more regarding Nox, that'd be interesting. I don't know what Nox would be, but Nox is like the and this he's like Sauron the way he's referenced in the lore because he is like the guy that can create life. I mean, this guy is like worse than Palpatine is in Star Wars because not only can he create and revive, he can command and conquer. I mean, this is you know if you understand him from the context, he's even worse than Voldemort. I mean, in terms of power capability, Nox is somebody that is not only worshipped but is seen as a god in this game. So it's something that I really wonder if we'll see more, and that's a whole story in and of itself. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.